My name is Olivia Marsh, and I am 35 years old. For 3 years, my mother-in-law lived in our converted basement apartment, and during that time, an increasing number of items from around our house simply began disappearing. A set of my grandmother's china, a small collection of jewelry, several of my late father's tools that I had kept specifically for sentimental reasons. Each time I mentioned something was missing, she suggested, gently, that I had probably misplaced it, that I had always been somewhat scattered with my belongings, that perhaps I should consider being more organized. Last month, she finally moved into her own apartment across town. I drove over to help her unpack, and in her garage, sitting beside boxes labeled in her own handwriting, I found a sealed plastic container with a single word written on the lid in permanent marker, Olivia's. Before I tell you what was actually inside that container, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop your city and the time where you are watching from. I read every single comment. Let me take you back to the year Diane moved into our basement, and the gradual pattern I did not recognize until it was almost too late to address. My husband Marcus and I bought our house 6 years ago. A modest 4-bedroom with a finished basement that included its own small kitchenette and bathroom. Originally intended as a guest space or eventual rental unit, Diane, Marcus's mother, had been living alone since Marcus's father passed away roughly 8 years earlier, managing reasonably well in her own small condo until a fall 3 years ago resulted in a hip fracture that made independent living considerably more difficult, at least temporarily while she recovered. Marcus suggested, immediately following her injury, that she move into our basement apartment during her recovery period, a suggestion that felt, at the time, entirely reasonable and entirely temporary. The kind of family support most people would readily extend during a genuine medical crisis. I agreed without hesitation, genuinely wanting to support Marcus's mother during a difficult period, not yet understanding how considerably that initially temporary arrangement would eventually extend, or what specific dynamics would develop during the years that followed. Diane's recovery progressed reasonably well over the following several months, though she continued, even after physically recovering from the hip fracture itself, expressing considerable anxiety about returning to living entirely alone, anxiety that Marcus, understandably sympathetic to his mother's genuine fear following a serious injury, found difficult to push back against directly. The arrangement that had initially been discussed as temporary, lasting perhaps 3 to 6 months during active recovery, gradually extended, through a series of incremental conversations, into something considerably more permanent. Diane eventually contributing modestly toward utilities, but never formally establishing any lease or rental agreement that might have created clearer boundaries around the arrangements, actual duration or terms. I want to be honest that I did not push back strongly against this gradual extension at the time, partly because Marcus clearly found the prospect of directly addressing his mother's continued residence genuinely difficult, and partly because, for the first year or so, the actual day-to-day experience of having Diane living downstairs remained generally manageable. The first incident that I now recognize as part of a larger pattern occurred roughly 14 months after Diane moved in, when I noticed my grandmother's china set, 6 place settings that had been passed down specifically to me following her death several years earlier, was missing several pieces from the cabinet where I kept it stored. I mentioned this to Diane directly, asking whether she had perhaps borrowed any pieces for a meal she had prepared downstairs. A reasonable question, given that she occasionally used items from our main kitchen when entertaining her own friends in the basement apartment. She told me she had not touched the china, suggesting instead that I had likely misplaced the missing pieces myself, perhaps during a recent reorganization of the kitchen cabinets that I had, in fact, undertaken several weeks earlier. I searched extensively for the missing pieces, finding nothing, eventually concluding, somewhat reluctantly, that perhaps I genuinely had misplaced them during the reorganization, despite my own fairly strong recollection of having accounted for the complete set during that process. I want to walk through, specifically, how this pattern developed over the following 2 years, because the gradual, individually explainable nature of each incident matters considerably to understanding why I did not recognize the actual scope of what was occurring until considerably later than I probably should have, roughly 4 months after the China incident. I noticed a small jewelry box containing several pieces I had inherited from my mother was missing from my bedroom dresser. Pieces that included a distinctive sapphire ring I particularly treasured given its specific sentimental significance. When I mentioned this to Diane, she expressed sympathetic concern, suggesting various places I might have placed the box without remembering, while also gently noting again that I had, quote, always struggled somewhat with keeping track of smaller items. A characterization that, repeated across multiple similar incidents, gradually began shaping how I understood my own reliability regarding my belongings. I did not yet understand, during this period, that this characterization was, itself, part of a deliberate pattern rather than simply genuine, sympathetic observation from someone who happened to share living space with me. The pattern continued, gradually, over the following 18 months, encompassing a range of items that, individually, seemed unconnected, but that, considered collectively, eventually formed a considerably more coherent picture than I initially recognized. Several of my late father's woodworking tools, kept specifically in our garage for sentimental reasons, despite my own lack of any genuine woodworking hobby, disappeared gradually, one or two at a time. Over a period of roughly a year, a decorative vase that had belonged to my paternal grandmother vanished from our living room mantel. Several photographs from a family album documenting my own childhood, rather than anything connected to Marcus's side of the family, went missing from a storage box in our hallway closet. Each time I noticed something missing, Diane's response remained remarkably consistent: sympathetic concern, gentle suggestions about where I might have misplaced the item, and an increasingly explicit characterization of me as someone who simply struggled with organization and with keeping consistent track of my own belongings. I want to be specific about how this characterization began affecting my relationship with Marcus during this same period, because it matters considerably to understanding why I did not address the situation more directly sooner than I eventually did. Marcus, hearing this characterization repeated consistently by his mother over an extended period, gradually began, I think largely unconsciously, rather than through any deliberate intention to undermine me, adopting some version of this same framing himself. He would occasionally suggest, when I expressed frustration about another missing item, that perhaps I should consider being more careful about where I place things. Language that, while not directly accusatory, nonetheless implicitly validated his mother's consistent characterization, rather than seriously considering alternative explanations for the accumulating pattern. I began, gradually, genuinely doubting my own memory and my own organizational habits, wondering whether I had, in fact, become considerably more careless with my belongings than I had previously believed myself to be. A kind of self-doubt that, looking back, represented exactly the effect that sustained consistent characterization from someone living in close proximity tends to produce over enough time. The specific incident that eventually prompted me to begin paying considerably more deliberate attention to this pattern occurred roughly 2.5 years into Diane's residence, when I noticed a small antique clock that had belonged to my paternal grandfather, an item with no significant monetary value, but with considerable personal sentimental importance, was missing from a shelf in our home office. This particular item mattered to me enough that I began, for the first time, actually documenting the pattern rather than simply accepting each individual loss as my own organizational failing. I created a simple list, recording each item I could specifically recall going missing over the preceding 2.5 years, along with approximate dates and circumstances surrounding when I had first noticed each absence. When I completed this list, I was genuinely startled by its actual scope. 17 separate items spanning the entire duration of Diane's residence, ranging from genuinely sentimental but modest items to several pieces with actual financial value, including the sapphire ring and several other jewelry pieces. I did not confront Diane directly about this comprehensive list immediately, partly because I remained uncertain, even having documented the pattern, whether I possessed sufficient actual evidence connecting these disappearances specifically to her, rather than simply representing, as she had consistently suggested, my own accumulated carelessness over an extended period. I began instead paying considerably more careful attention to my own belongings, noting specifically when and how I last recalled seeing particular items, attempting to establish a clearer pattern that might eventually provide more definitive evidence regarding the actual cause of these accumulating disappearances. I want to be honest that this period of careful, deliberate observation, sustained over several additional months, represented a genuinely uncomfortable experience. Essentially, surveilling my own home and my own mother-in-law's behavior in ways that felt, at times, almost paranoid. Despite my own growing conviction that something considerably more deliberate than simple carelessness was actually occurring, Diane announced, roughly 4 months after I began this more careful observation, that she had decided, finally, to move into her own apartment, having found a suitable senior living community across town that offered the kind of independent living arrangement combined with available support services that addressed her earlier anxiety about living entirely alone. I want to be specific about my own complicated reaction to this announcement, recognizing, even as I genuinely supported her transition toward greater independence, a particular curiosity about whether her eventual departure might finally provide some clarity regarding the pattern of disappearances I had been documenting and observing for the preceding several months. Diane's move occurred over the following 6 weeks, a gradual process of packing and organizing her belongings, during which I offered repeatedly to help with various aspects of the transition, partly out of genuine willingness to support her, and partly, I will admit honestly, out of a specific curiosity about what I might observe during this process. The actual moving day arrived on a Saturday, roughly 1 month ago. Marcus and I both helping transport boxes and furniture to Diane's new apartment, a process that extended across most of the day, given the accumulated volume of belongings she had gathered during her 3 years living in our basement. I want to walk through, specifically, what occurred once we had transported the majority of her belongings and began helping her organize items within her new garage space, a small attached single-car garage that came with her new apartment unit. While arranging several boxes Diane had labeled in her own handwriting, indicating their general contents: kitchen items, winter clothing, photographs, I noticed a sealed plastic storage container, considerably more carefully sealed than the other moving boxes. Positioned somewhat apart from the others toward the back of the garage space, the container had a single word written across the lid in permanent marker, in Diane's distinctive handwriting, Olivia's. I want to be honest about the specific moment I noticed this container, recognizing, immediately, a kind of cold, disorienting recognition, given everything I had spent the preceding months documenting and suspecting, but that I had never actually confirmed through any concrete physical evidence. I called Marcus over, showing him the container, asking directly whether he had any idea why his mother would have a sealed container specifically labeled with my name, separate from her own general moving boxes. Marcus looked genuinely confused, suggesting perhaps it represented some gift or item Diane had specifically set aside for me that she simply had not yet had the opportunity to give me directly. Diane, who had been organizing items inside her new apartment during this exchange, returned to the garage at that exact moment, her expression, upon seeing us standing beside the container, shifting almost immediately from neutral pleasantness to something considerably more guarded. I asked her, directly, what was inside the container. She hesitated, noticeably, before responding that she believed it contained some old household items she had been meaning to sort through, items that had simply accumulated over her years living in our basement, that she had not yet had time to properly organize or return. I asked whether I could open it directly. Given that it was explicitly labeled with my own name, she hesitated again, longer this time, before telling me that would be fine, though her tone suggested considerably more reluctance than her actual words conveyed. I opened the container, with Marcus standing directly beside me, both of us watching as I lifted the lid. Inside, carefully wrapped in newspaper and packed with considerable care, were the missing pieces from my grandmother's china set. Beside them, in a smaller box within the larger container, was the jewelry box containing my mother's pieces, including the sapphire ring I had genuinely believed lost for nearly 2 years. Several of my father's woodworking tools were wrapped individually in cloth. The decorative vase from my grandmother sat carefully cushioned in one corner. The antique clock from my grandfather, the specific item that had prompted me to begin documenting the broader pattern, was wrapped separately. Positioned near the top of the container, I counted, eventually, 14 of the 17 items I had documented as missing over the preceding 3 years, all carefully preserved, all clearly deliberately collected rather than simply accidentally misplaced during the ordinary chaos of shared household living. Marcus stood beside me, completely silent, staring at the contents of the container, his expression shifting through what I recognized as genuine shock. The recognition, I think, finally arriving directly and undeniably, of a pattern he had previously gradually allowed himself to dismiss or minimize based on his mother's consistent characterization of me as simply careless or disorganized. I asked Diane directly why she had taken these specific items that held genuine sentimental significance to me personally, items that had nothing whatsoever to do with anything connected to her own life or her own family history. She did not have a particularly coherent answer to that question. She said eventually, something about feeling that certain items deserved, quote, better care than I was apparently providing them. A justification that, even as she offered it, seemed to recognize its own inadequacy given the clear evidence of deliberate collection and careful preservation that the container itself represented. I want to be honest about how genuinely difficult that specific moment was. Standing in a garage with definitive physical proof of nearly 3 years of deliberate deception that had not only resulted in the actual loss of meaningful personal items, but had also gradually undermined my own confidence in my basic perception and memory regarding my own belongings within my own home. Marcus, to his credit, in that specific moment, did not attempt to minimize or rationalize what we had just discovered. He told his mother directly that this represented a serious violation of trust, considerably beyond any reasonable explanation regarding simply wanting to, quote, better care for certain items, and that he needed time to process what this revelation meant for his own understanding of the preceding 3 years. We left Diane's apartment that afternoon without the typical warm farewell that might have accompanied helping a family member transition into a long-anticipated new home. The conversation that followed, between Marcus and me, extended across the following several days, both of us working through the considerable implications of what we had discovered. I retrieved all 14 items from the container before we left that day, along with a clear, if uncomfortable, conversation with Diane, acknowledging that the remaining 3 items I had documented as missing, including a small decorative box and 2 photographs, apparently had not survived whatever process had led to the collection of the other 14 pieces. Items she claimed, with considerably less conviction than her earlier explanations, she genuinely could not account for. I do not know, with complete certainty, whether those 3 additional items were ever actually taken by Diane specifically, or whether they represent genuine losses unrelated to this particular pattern. I have chosen, ultimately, not to pursue that specific uncertainty further, recognizing that the 14 items I did recover, along with the clear, undeniable evidence the container itself represented, provided sufficient resolution to the broader pattern I had spent years documenting and doubting my own perception about. It has been 5 weeks since that Saturday in Diane's garage. Marcus and I have had several extended conversations regarding what this discovery means for our family's relationship with his mother going forward. Conversations that remain, genuinely, still somewhat unresolved. Diane has not offered the kind of direct, comprehensive explanation or apology that I think the situation genuinely warrants, continuing to characterize her actions through a kind of vague, insufficient justification about wanting to, quote, preserve certain items properly, language that conspicuously avoids any genuine acknowledgement of the deliberate, sustained deception the pattern actually represented, including her consistent characterization of me as simply careless or disorganized throughout the entire period. Marcus has, notably, stopped reflexively validating his mother's characterizations of various situations since this discovery, a shift that, while emerging from a genuinely painful revelation, has measurably improved how he and I navigate disagreements or concerns I raise going forward. No longer filtered through an implicit assumption that his mother's perspective deserves automatic credibility over my own direct experience. I have placed all 14 recovered items back in their original locations throughout our house. The china back in its cabinet, the jewelry back in my dresser, my father's tools back in the garage, the clock back on its shelf in the office. Seeing them return to their proper places has provided a kind of quiet, tangible resolution that I had genuinely not expected to ever actually experience. Having largely accepted, before that Saturday, that these items were simply permanently lost, I think often about the nearly 3 years during which I gradually doubted my own clear memory and my own basic competence regarding my own belongings. A doubt that I now understand clearly reflected a deliberate, sustained pattern of deception rather than any genuine carelessness or disorganization on my own part. I think, too, about how close that pattern came to permanently shaping my own self-perception. Had Diane's eventual move not provided the specific opportunity to discover definitive, physical evidence that finally, undeniably, confirmed what I had spent years suspecting, but had never been able to fully prove. That is my story. If you have ever had your own perception or memory consistently doubted, only to eventually discover definitive proof that confirmed what you had been experiencing all along, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments, and if this story reminded you that sustained, consistent doubt directed at you can sometimes mask something considerably more deliberate happening beneath the surface, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. I will see you in the next one.